Friends, we're really fortunate to have a guest on today that is America's foremost expert on cults, how they form and how they operate. Steven Hassan is a licensed mental health professional and the founding director of the Freedom of Mind Resource Center and the author of several books, including Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind, Helping Loved Ones Leave Controlling People, Cults, and Beliefs, and most recently, The Cult of Trump. I can't even imagine what that's about. So, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you. So you and I have a bit in common. We were both raised in high-demand religions, and I would say arguably cults. Our listeners will know my background is an extremely conservative siege mentality Mormonism, but they may not be familiar with what you were up to in the 70s while I was doing baptisms for the dead. Can you give us a little intro to your background with cults?
Yeah, absolutely. One correction. I, unlike you, was not raised in a cult, but I was recruited into the Moonies when I was 19 and a college student at Queens College. And I wound up coming to believe that the Messiah was on the earth. He was this fat Korean billionaire with a gun factory, and who did mass weddings. 30,000 couples at one time was his record of assigning people to marry one another. But
were you married in that, Stephen?
No, fortunately, I was considered to be too young to be in one of them, but I was identified as a rising leader and indoctrinated to be a leader in the American cult, which left me feeling very guilty when I woke up after my deprogramming and got out. But
right.
the point is that I experienced a radical personality change, a radical change of my beliefs. I was a poetry major in college. I was asked to throw out all my poetry to show my allegiance to God.
And you did, didn't you? You discarded all of your work. Oh my God.
And cut off from my family, dropped out of college, thought Armageddon was going to happen in 1977. And my family and friends were horrified because I was very educated, very bright. I had skipped 8th grade. I was an extra honor student. And they couldn't talk to me. It just, you're brainwashed, you're in a cult. And of course, I didn't think I was in a cult. And I was convinced that they were being manipulated by Satan. And I got out after a near fatal van crash where I fell asleep at the wheel of the van and drove it in the back of a tractor trailer truck at 80 miles an hour, which led to 2 weeks in the hospital and operation and a deprogramming that my family arranged. It started involuntarily and then it went voluntary. Not because I wanted to leave the group or I had any doubts. I had zero doubts. But I wanted to prove to my family I wasn't brainwashed. So I agreed to listen and learn. And fortunately, I woke up and went, oh my God, this is Chinese communist brainwashing techniques and strategies. And then I became literally obsessed with wanting to understand, how did this happen to me? And how did that happen to Patty Hearst? How did it happen to Jim, later to Jim Jones's People's Temple? And I became a mental health professional in 85. I got my master's degree, currently in a doctoral program at age 65, because I want to change the legal system if I can, or at least help it change to understand brainwashing and mind control.
Right. That car accident could not be a more literal road to Damascus moment, could it? That's the moment it all changed for you.
Well, it opened the door to my family knowing where I was, because they didn't know where I was, and I had crutches and a cast on my right leg from my toes to my groin. So the initial deprogramming, they took my crutches away, and I couldn't fight and I couldn't run away. So
you were stuck.
It made it a lot more doable because I was trained in martial arts in the cult, and I would have done a lot of violence because I was that programmed.
Oh my God. So as you say, when you, after you were deprogrammed and you left the cult, the three of us are all former Mormons on this show. And after having left what I consider, my experience was a cult, like you, I think I'm endlessly fascinated by the phenomenon of dangerous and irrational beliefs that we've done a bunch of segments on, like your old friends, the Moonies. We've done Am Shinrikyo, the People's Temple, of course. Lots of cults that are kind of the dragon's teeth out here in Mormon country, like the Family of David and Warren Jeffs and the Short Creek polygamists, Elizabeth Smart's kidnapper, Brian David Mitchell. Mm-hmm. And then a ton on the outside, like the Divine Light Mission, the Solar Temple, Westboro Baptists, MLMs, we kind of run the gamut. But before I get to the cult that really kind of drove our listeners around the bend, you developed, when you left the Moonies and became a healthcare professional, you developed a system by which you could kind of measure whether something was a cult or not. Is that correct?
Not exactly, but I'll explain. So Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist, had written the seminal volume called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism about Chinese communist brainwashing programs. And he outlined 8 criteria that any environment may be judged as a brainwashing, or he preferred the term thought reform environment. Mm-hmm. And then Margaret Singer came up with a model of 6 conditions, but both models just didn't really work as well as I wanted something to work. And I was exposed in my research about psychology to Leon Festinger's work, which is cognitive dissonance theory. He actually wrote a book in 1956 called When Prophecies Fail, about a UFO cult. And he studied with his students this cult, and he wondered why people, when the spaceship didn't come to the mountaintop as prophesied, why people believed more and not less.
Right.
So he posited this theory, which has since been validated for decades, that we have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And as human beings, we like to be congruent. We like to have alignment between our beliefs, our feelings, and our behaviors. And if you can get someone to change their behavior radically, they're going to change their beliefs and rationalize to explain the radical behavior. And likewise, their feelings will fall in alignment. So I took those 3 criteria, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and I said, let's look at, like the Moonies and how they recruit and indoctrinate. So I started listing all the behavioral control elements and all of the thought control elements, and then the emotional control elements. And I'm like, I'm onto something here, because this really helps to organize this. But there was another thing that was missing. It took me a while to figure it out, but it was information control. And because I would never have gotten into the cult if I hadn't been lied to by my recruiters, and lied in the sense of withholding vital information, distorting information to make it more palatable, and outright lying, like they said they weren't religious. They weren't in a religious group, when in fact
the Moonies told you that.
Yeah, the recruiters of the Moonies told me that.
Wow.
Yeah, and I later, as a recruiter, did it to other people, because that's what was done to me.
Right.
So the whole lack of informed consent is a huge identifying mark for any destructive cult. And and I guess that there's more elements to information control, about spying on each other, using information about your past against you, to keep you in line. There's a whole list of it. And in fact, pertaining to the Mormons, I did a podcast with John Dehlin, and I asked him to read Combating before we did the interview. And he basically texted me and said, your book is blowing my mind. And the next thing I know is I get the Bite model color-coded by John, which I had never thought to color code it, but he added a new dimension to it, where he said things like not really practiced by the LDS Church, or especially with the missions, with the 2-year missions, this is present. And yes, it exists in the LDS Church, or it doesn't. So that exists on my freedomofmind.com website for anyone who wants to look at the color-coded bite model for the Mormons. So going back to your question, I also have something referred to as the influence continuum, which is on my website as well and in my books, where if you think about it, ethical influence is on one side and unethical influence is the other side. And so I do take the position that there can be cults that are not authoritarian, destructive cults. They're just wacko, weirdo groups that you're really into. But you're not lied to get into it. You're free to leave. You're free to read whatever you want to read, talk to ex-members or whatever. You have complete conscience and critical thinking intact. Whereas destructive authoritarian cults practice the bite model to the extreme, where they give you a black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil thought frame, where we know the truth and everyone else is in darkness. They have these behavioral codes, which could include change of clothing and diet and where you sleep and who you can associate with, and needing to ask permission for major life decisions, with an emphasis on obedience and dependency on the leader, the doctrine, or the policies of the group. And then, of course, I want to just touch on emotional control, where on the one hand, destructive cults will make you feel really special and chosen, and make you feel like you're part of the elite. On the other hand, it's a lot about guilt and fear manipulation. And I find that the ultimate mind control methodology is phobia induction, where they implant irrational fears in people's minds that if they question the group or the leader, or want to leave the group, terrible things are going to happen to you. So that in the mind of a member of a destructive cult, you can't imagine leaving and being happy and fulfilled. You can only imagine leaving and being miserable, suffering in hell, being possessed by demons, becoming a drug addict.
It's incredibly abusive. It's an incredibly terrible seed to plant, especially in young people. A lot of us grew up with the fear of hell and demons and for the slightest transgressions. And I just think it's one of the most insanely terrible manipulations that parents and or societies.
I completely agree. And I teach my clients, because this is what I do for a living, is I help people who've exited recover. And I also guide families and friends who want to rescue someone out of a cult. And I coach them on how to do that. I have something called the strategic interactive approach. But it's absolutely vital for anyone who's been exposed to a mind control cult to understand the concept of a phobia and how it's different from real fear, where there's an actual danger. Like, don't touch the third rail at the railway station because you'll get electrocuted. Like, that should be fearful, so you stay away from it.
It's a healthy fear.
Yeah, versus somebody drawing a chalk line on a carpet and saying, "Don't step on this; you're going to be electrocuted."
Right.
And for me, any group that says they know what reality is and what's going to happen after we die. We all know we die as human beings, or any sentient life dies. Anyone who says they know what's going to happen, you say, prove it.
Yes.
Prove it, and I'll believe it. If you can't prove it, and it's a story, and is this a story that's helpful? for me in terms of my ability to live my life, or is it helpful for the institution because you'll stay loyal and you'll give money to them and you'll recruit
Yes.
for them and you'll do their bidding for them, or politics or
Absolutely.
whatever,
Yeah. We
right?
we did a segment with our mutual friend, Dr. Chrissy Stroop,
Mm-hmm.
and about the rapture anxiety,
Yep.
about people who are really have their whole lives struggled with the fact that if they got home and their family was gone, they're like, oh fuck, they're gone. The rapture.
Right.
If it's and what an insane thing to drill into the head of a perfectly normal human being.
Yeah. And I do want to tell your listeners I was raised Jewish, so I did not know anything about Satan or demons or rapture. I really didn't have any close friends until college who were not Jewish. And it seemed to me at the time like that was insane. And how could anyone believe that? But then I got recruited into the Moonies, and that's what I believe too.
Yeah, it's just absolutely insidious. So now that people understand some of the kind of diagnostic ways to look at a yardstick maybe that the bite model provides to kind of look at things they were or are involved with as perhaps dangerous or insidious.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about what we got the most correspondence of from any segment we've ever done. And it was extremely insidious. And that is a very obscure cult called the Anthill Kids.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll do a very quick primer for people who did not listen to our episode number 128. And if you haven't, be warned, it's a fucking nightmare. But a guy named Roch Theriault, I believe pronounced his name, split off from the Seventh-day Adventists in the late 70s and started a tiny apocalyptic cult in rural Quebec. And what followed was a sadistic vision of hell Dante never dreamed of, with murder, mutilation, starvation, rape and molestation of every sort. And people not only stayed when Theriault was, normally in a drunken stupor and they easily could have escaped, and he also sometimes traveled here to Utah, lucky us, for weeks at a time, so they could have escaped then. Or even worse, some of his most grievously wounded victims would escape only to return to the cult within days of their horrible dismemberments. So after all that correspondence, Steve, we got so much, we had such a response. I told our listeners I would try to get you on to answer the burning question, which is, how can something like this go on and on? Like, how could this self-perpetuate for the years that it did?
Mm-hmm. So, where to start in just a short amount of time to explain? I guess what I want to start with is that human beings are organisms that need information. We have five senses, and we're socialized from birth. And we're very adaptable and flexible, and we are hardwired for survival choices. Mm-hmm. We're hardwired genetically to follow who we think are legitimate leaders. Mm-hmm. We're hardwired to follow our peers, people that we identify with. And use them as a measuring stick for what reality is. So that's the baseline. Now, learning social psychology, learning neuroscience, learning psychology gives you a toolbox to step beyond our programming and to understand things like mind control and undue influence and brainwashing. But without that knowledge, people do the best they can to adapt and to survive. With that as the beginning, what I would next say is that from my experience and then 44 years of activism working with folks, what the best model to explain it is what's called a dissociative disorder model, which means that For example, using me, there was the Steve Hassan that I grew up as, the youngest of three kids, two older sisters, my mom and my dad in Queens, New York. And then I got into the Moonies, and now Moon and his wife were my true parents.
Right.
And Milton and Estelle were only my physical parents. And I was, that identity was of Satan. And so the cult identity then was trained to suppress the old identity as evil, as my fallen nature. And I was trained to do things like thought stopping and emotion blocking to stay true to the leader and the doctrine and the organization.
Right.
So this suppression of your own intelligence, your own conscience, your own critical faculties is a core feature of destructive mind control cults.
Mm-hmm.
I've already mentioned the bite model, and I think that if you go through the bite model, which is all on my website, freedomofmind.com, and look at that particular cult, you'll see that their behavior was controlled, their information was controlled, their thoughts were controlled, and their emotions were controlled, all to be dependent and obedient on who they came to believe was a prophet, someone who was a special person of God, who prophesied the Armageddon and the end of the earth, and that only by doing what he told you would you be saved. And that frame, that ideology, was co-opting people's sense of survival, in the sense of having their arms chopped off or their testicles amputated without anesthesia. And again,
so you're familiar with his work.
well, yes, unfortunately, in this business, I'm asked often to do interviews about all types of cults I've never heard of, and
right.
But the analysis always fits, because if you understand, for example, cognitive dissonance, if you do an extreme behavior, the beliefs are going to rationalize that behavior. Right. And in a mind control cult, the leader claims to be perfect. Even this guy was a drunkard and would have, alcoholic binges and then apologize.
Right.
But, people were basically suppressing their own common sense, critical thinking, and deferring to, this is God's choice for me. This is a test. This is a trial. They may have any number of justifications for why to stay involved. It seems he was a major womanizer.
Yeah.
I would predict he clearly had a very traumatized childhood where he was physically abused and maybe sexually abused as well. Mm-hmm. And he used sex as a technique to break down people's sense of self, to get them to do things he wanted them to do, including pedophilia.
Right.
And so that's the recipe generically for mind control cults, whether they're religious cults, political cults, therapy cults, or just a cult of personality, which is really how I think of this particular cult. It's a cult of personality where he kind of picked and chose different beliefs from other religions and other cults.
Yeah, he was kind of a magpie. He just made it. It seemed like he kind of winged it.
And people will believe what they want to believe. And someone who has some charisma and supposedly had penetrating eyes, which makes me wonder if he had any training in hypnosis. But if he looks you in the eyes and says, you are my wife, eternal wife, and 9, you are my wife and I love you and no one can love you like me. And we are connected for eternity. I know as ex-Mormons, that rap, about, eternal marriages. It's very powerful to keep you in that system. In all of your interviews, have you come across anyone talking about sunk cost fallacy?
We've definitely talked about the sunk cost fallacy, and I was going to ask you about that. If you feel like that is why some of these people, even like this poor woman who was literally had her arm hacked off and then returned, if you feel, I mean, her sunk cost was pretty profound at that point, right?
It is. Or, it really, you've invested this much, and then you've invested a year, you've invested 2 years, you've invested
an
10
arm.
years. Now you have children with this guy,
right?
Who all look like him, right?
Right.
I just recently watched with my wife Tiger King on Netflix.
It's kind of a cult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of them.
all these tigers. What is it about tigers that does this to people?
I actually met Bhagwan Antle, who was...
You did?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he would bring his creatures to a place called King Richard's Fair in Carver, Massachusetts, which is in the fall. And I just fell in love with tigers and ligers. He also had an elephant. And
you're very vulnerable to cults, Stephen.
I love animals. They are entrancing. I'm a major, talk about cults. I am a major scuba diver cult person who loves being underwater and floating and looking at gorgeous things.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a good cult. I highly approve.
It costs money, and you got to fly there, and you got to observe the safety precautions because
got to control your breathing. It's all in the bite model.
But I love scuba diving.
That's awesome. Well, let me ask you one last question, Stephen.
Sure.
While I've long known you were a Moonie, it wasn't until recently I learned from watching a video interview with you that you personally knew the second coming of Christ, the perfected Adam, the Reverend Moon himself.
Yeah, I don't like anyone calling him a reverend because he was self-ordained. He said, he has no no credentials. But yeah, no, I was groomed to be the leader, a top leader in the United States, and got to meet him and listen to him in person many, many, many times over the 2.5 years.
Wow.
And it was actually that exposure to him that helped me in my deprogramming, because
you saw him as a person.
Well, I saw that what we were told as leaders was very different than what he was telling the members or what he was telling the outside world.
Right.
And that dissonance helped to eventually wake me up to, wait a minute, he's a liar.
Right.
And if he's a liar, how can he be trustworthy? And if he's a liar, how could he be God's agent on earth? Because we teach God as a God of truth. So it was that kind of, basic reasoning that started coming back online for me that helped me to exit. And then I scratched my head and said, how did this happen to me? How did I come to believe such insane beliefs and do such horrible things as a cult member?
Well, I think a lot of us who came out of it still scratch our heads, and just wonder how we, the three of us were raised in it. You had a slightly different thing, but it's the same for all kinds of converts, right?
Yeah, I think you get more of a pass than me because I had a very strong, clear identity and value system. And I read 1984 and I learned about the Holocaust and Hitler. I knew about authoritarianism, but it still happened to me.
Isn't that crazy?
You were socialized in it by your family. So in my opinion, you get more of a pass for having been raised. And I give you kudos for waking up and going, you know what? I don't choose to believe in stories that make no sense or that are based on lies.
Yeah, no, it takes courage sometimes for people to do it, but it's great when they finally do. But I wanted to ask you one final thing about Reverend or some young moon.
Sun Myung Moon, thank you.
When we did our segment on the Moonies and the Unification Church, I discovered that he'd traveled to all 48 contiguous states in a blue station wagon and buried a piece of sacred Korean soil in each. So please tell me you know where he did this in Utah. You've got to tell me.
I don't know where he did. I don't know where he did it in Utah, and I think that's a story that may not be true.
Oh, bummer.
But Moonies believe Korea is God's chosen nation, and
right, yeah,
and everyone would speak Korean, and all other religions will be wiped out by us meaning the Moonies. When we took power, Moon said that democracy was satanic, and he wanted a theocracy with him and his children and his surrogate children, which was the believers, to take over and run the world.
Well, they're almost there. I think they're on the edge.
Well, people don't realize they're still around. They have a gun factory in the U.S., in Pennsylvania. Yeah. They own the Washington Times newspaper and UPI. Yep. And they're still very active with lots of different names and front groups. They don't use
we saw their
church anymore.
We saw their blessing of the machine gun service by Stoneman Douglas High School, or in Florida after the shooting, which is insane. So, well, it's been a lovely pleasure to talk to you, Steven. Where can our listeners find you and your good work? You've mentioned it before, but if you want to talk about what the latest stuff is.
Yeah, I want to invite everybody to check out my website, freedomofmind.com. I'm on Twitter at cultexpert, and LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. And I'm concerned, broadly about human rights and wishing people to be educated consumers and to understand how the mind works and how to understand if they're getting disinformation, to not believe disinformation or propaganda, and reality tests and use your critical thinking. And if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate the good work you're doing. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks. Continued success.
Yes, take care.